Good morning. I'm Catherine Baird, CEO of Ethics Gain. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with us as we explore ethical decision-making and our ethical values that determine who we are as human beings. While I would enjoy being with you in person and having our conversation in a real conversation, I am thankful for video and these other kinds of technology that allow us to share together these ideas. Now let's go on a little journey and discover something about ourselves. As we begin to think about ethics, it's about what we believe and how our lives change over time. And so we're going to talk about how we shape our values and how we can enhance our effectiveness. Now, the first question that I often get asked is, can ethics make a difference? And the answer is, if we focus on our individual developmental tasks that we need to grow, then we'll be just fine. And we also then begin to choose behaviors that count for being good in our community and as an individual. Ethics at its core is translating values into action. None of us know each other's hearts. We only know our behaviors. And so as we are with these behaviors, we can see what people's values are. Now, these values are ideals that become significant to our lives. Each of us have a set of these values that are our core ways of living and being together. We then can tell what they are through the priorities that we choose, and we see that we act on them consistently and repeatedly in our lives. And so as we work together and as you get to know people well, you begin to see what values are important to them, and we see that these values then become their ethical perspectives. Now, as we think about our core values and commitments, those are pretty straight ahead. What is harder, of course, is our shadow side and where we can be tempted. And that's the value of the ethical lens inventory and becoming ethically aware. A couple of definitions. Each of you listening to this conversation has a compass of your own personal values and motives. You know what you care about, you know what's important. We then come together with our personal values to determine our shared community values in a classroom, in the larger university, in our larger community, in our internships, these various places that we work and we play together. We come up with shared community values. And then as we become a professional, we have shared and mutually enforced behaviors that go with that profession. The question that bothered me from the time I was your age was, if everybody is so clear about right and wrong, about what it is that we should be doing, if I can listen to my gut and know what I should do, why are there so many different answers? And the answer is because all of our values translated into actions are contextual. They depend on the people that are there. They depend on the situation that's at hand. They depend on what we're trying to accomplish. And so we have to learn how to exercise what is called prudential judgment, wisdom, as we apply these various theories and ideas to our everyday life. Now, if we were living 400 years ago, we would be in what is known as the age of belief. All truth would be divinely revealed. It would come through our scriptures. It would come through our religious leaders. It would come through our political leaders, the kings, the queens. Our authority figures would tell us what we were supposed to do. Now, with the age of reason, think Galileo discovering that the earth really goes around the sun and not the sun around the earth. The belief was that all truth could be discovered through reason and science. And that idea was translated into ethics as well. The belief was that through reason and experience, we could discover universal principles by which all people should live. The problem is that with 300 years of work, those universal principles never were shaped, and we could never find them. And so as we began to worry then that if we couldn't find these principles, we would have ethical relativism. No moral system would be better than another. Civilization would come to an end, and we would not know how to live effectively to each other. So as I began my work, the question was, is there some other way besides ethical relativism in order to learn to live and work together? I began by asking, is there a conversation that everybody is having, regardless of these ethical perspectives? And the answer turned out to be yes. Every ethical theory has a conversation about the rights of the individual versus the rights of the community. Now, you and I have been living through that for the past 18, 24 months as we're working with COVID. When do individuals get to wear a mask and say, I'm going to do this? And when do they get to say, no, I'm not? When does the community get to say, if you're going to come and be with us together, you have to wear a mask? When does the community get to say, if you want to work for us, if you want to come to this event, you have to be vaccinated? And when do individuals get to say, I really don't want to be vaccinated, I'm going to choose not to? And that determines the ethical values and the behaviors then of our community. The other one is head and heart. When do we follow principles? When do we follow rules? When do we follow guidelines? When do we follow science? And when do we allow individuals to make a choice based on their own values and their own beliefs? The conversation that's unfolding right now is around religious exemptions for vaccinations. When does an individual get to say, I really don't believe in and I don't want to have a vaccination? And when do we say the science says that this is safe? The rules say you're going to have to, and there it is. Those conversations that we have on an ongoing basis shape our ethical behaviors and our lives together. And it turns out that the 4 primary ethical theories that we all study in our classes look at the world slightly differently and prioritize those conversations differently. And then, depending on how you prioritize the conversations, you have different ideas of what behaviors and what values are important. So you can see up here in the responsibilities lens, people in this lens will prioritize freedom, being accountable, being principled, where people down in this lens are going to prioritize being virtuous and setting a good example and acting with compassion. Many of the misunderstandings that we have as humans come because we are prioritizing different values and don't know how to have conversations about which values should take priority when. So let's take a little dive into each of these theories. Consequentialism says our experience should count. Individuals following their heart's desires get to choose the goals and meanings for their lives. The belief is that people will cooperate to create the greatest good. Martha Nussbaum, who is writing currently at the University of Chicago, says what each of us need to do is build capacity for living into our desires and cooperating with other people. 17% of people favor this lens. The next lens is reason. Individuals use their reason to determine the principles by which they would live. And Immanuel Kant, who is our philosopher behind this theory, said all reasonable people will identify the same principles and adopt the same duties, and therefore we will know how to live together. And about 26% of people favor this lens. The next one, the justice lens, the social contract theories say members of the community use their reason to determine how goods will be distributed and how power will be used. Kwame Appiah, who is writing at University of NYU, says that as we begin to identify our community, we will agree on how we can create a community where all can thrive. And about 11% of people favor this lens. And then our final lens becomes virtue ethics. Members of the community determine the character traits that represent virtuous living. And Alistair McIntyre, who works with the University of Notre Dame, said, as we come together in conversations, we will define what behavior counts for being ethical in an established role. And about 22% of people are in this lens. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with 4 ways of looking at the world, none of which are right, each of which have a contribution. And we came to this conclusion as we began looking at 2 scientific disruptions that happened in the past 100 years. The first was evolution. Now, we're not going to talk about the biology of evolution, but what we're going to notice is that all systems gradually change. Whether it be a university setting, whether it be a family understanding, whether it be businesses, systems change, and we have to learn how to adapt and change with those systems. The other piece is relativity. What is real is not discoverable. Now, you and I can both say that you're watching a video, but the meaning that you give to the video and how you interpret whether this is good or bad or indifferent, whether the quality of the sound is good or bad, all of those are the meanings that we give to what appear to be facts. And so that reality cannot be discovered by science, but can only be interpreted through human beings. What did that mean for ethics? Well, we had a body of scholars who were working at the same time I was, who said, let's take a look at biology. How many of these ethical tendencies are inherited? And it turns out about 30% of who you and I are as human beings is because of our biology, whether we're going to be sociable or not sociable, whether we're going to like people or not. Another 30% or so comes from our sociology. As we are born into a community, we have a family of some variety, we have expectations of behaviors, we have religious traditions, we have community expectations. We learn what is good and what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, and how we need to live in order to not get punished or kicked out of community. And those then form what we call our core ethical self. The third part is our psychology, our heads, as we begin to develop an understanding of how we're supposed to act. We have people, for example, who don't mind taking risks and they're willing to risk everything. We have others who are risk averse. We have people who are highly sensitive to what other people think and other people who don't care in the least. All of this is our own understanding and how we shape how we're going to live and work with others. But that didn't tell us what we should do. It didn't tell us what the best behaviors were. It didn't tell us how we needed to live together. We moved then to what we call an ethics of ambiguity. We don't have any agreed upon principles. We don't have any agreed upon roles. We don't have any agreed upon priorities. So how do we know what we should do? This, interestingly enough, gives us a great deal of power, because we now know that all of our small acts of moral courage or cowardice can shape the direction of our lives. We don't have to be huge heroes, and we don't have to be on the front page of the paper, but the choices we make, as small as to pick up a piece of trash, to be kind to someone else, to say thank you to someone for helping us, all of those shape the direction of our lives and the lives of others. So each of us have a great deal of power and ability to shape our world. So how do we begin? We start with ethical awareness, knowing yourself. What do you believe? How do you behave? When do you get grumpy? When are you cheerful? What sets you off? As we begin to know ourselves, we can moderate our behavior, and we can begin to engage with ourselves and others in a way that's more compassionate and more kind. Watch for the patterns. What habits do we have? Is there a time that you're always rude? Is there a time that we're always distracted? Is there a time we're always kind? What are those patterns? And then as we act from the best we know at the time, we can develop moral courage. I had a friend of mine who asked this past week, what do we do about regret? What I know now, I would never have done the things I did at 20 or 30. And I said, you know, and you're compassionate with yourself because you're doing the very best you know at the time. And so as we grow in ethical awareness, we are able to choose behaviors and ways of being that are the best that we know. Now, it turns out that as we live into this sense of self-awareness, Simone de Beauvoir gave us some hints about how we could do it well. Don't expect certainty. You can begin to think about how to react to somebody and how to do, and you'll have no idea what somebody else is going to do. And so as you develop your own moral compass, be clear that you're going to get different reactions from people. But don't stop from acting. The only way we know we're human is through choosing to act. But adjust to those ambiguities. As you get responses, you adjust your behaviors. As you begin to understand how the culture is going to be, we can adjust together. And so we begin to have this understanding of ongoing small adjustments in our lives together. Now, it turns out that as we make these adjustments, we have to be aware of the core human needs. So people down in the results lens are focused on getting material and social resources. What are our goals? What do we want to do? People up in the responsibilities lens are interested in truth. What do we know? What principles are going to work? People over in the relationship lens care about protecting the community. What processes do we need? What justice do we need to have? How do we distribute resources? And people down in the reputation lens care about how do we belong? How do we fit? And so as we begin to work in our own understanding of ourselves, all four of these quadrants, if you will, all four of these needs have to be met. The ethical lens inventory helps you begin to understand that. So we have the questions, and often these questions are challenging as people see that they could go different directions. They could change their mind about what behaviors they would choose based on the context. Depending on where you landed, you had one of what we have 57 different explanations. And these are just gradations in how you prioritize these core conversations and the values. Now, when I ask people whether or not the descriptions were accurate, most of them go, well, pretty much, except I really didn't like my shadow side. I really didn't like those parts of reacting to our temptations. And those, of course, are the places where we can grow. If you're on a far edge, it shows you have a very strong commitment and may have difficulties working with different thinking people. When people ask me whether or not people change over time, this is the one change we see. People on the far edges tend to moderate towards the middle as they get more experience working with people who think differently and act differently than them. People in the middle can see all sides of a question and they have difficulties making their decisions. And so they have to learn to be more confident in their choices that they make as they move forward. If you're on a line, you just use the weaknesses and strengths of both as you balance between and among the lenses. The next step then is noticing all of these differences. We begin to celebrate these differences as we embrace ethical agility. Notice how others contribute to the variety of life, how they give us opportunities to think about the world and experience the world differently. I had a girlfriend that I taught with for many years who actually is an avid mountain climber and taught me the importance of being on a rope team. And she uses that metaphor all the time to teach how to be in community. And I have learned to see how others contribute to me and to the work that I do. I learned to listen carefully as I explored the knowledge and the experience and the values of others. So often we are so committed to being right that we don't listen to other people to see what's important. And then as we notice these connections, we can celebrate our interdependency. Now, the philosopher that helps us begin to think about how do we develop ethical agility is Alfred Whitehead. He said, we have to remember that all of us together determine what is going to be real for us. Is this experience going to be a good experience or a bad experience? Is this useful or not useful? Is this one that we can celebrate, or do we need to do some changes? Every decision we make then changes our world slightly. Again, if we are kind, if we are respectful, if we notice somebody else, those kinds of things will shift our world. And it will also determine your value, because our value is connected to everybody. As people decide whether the work I do is important or not, if it shifts them or not, all of those changes make a difference in how I see myself and how you see yourself. So again, going back to our core needs, what we want to do is to notice that we are interdependent. Individuals make choices that contribute to their happiness, and we want to keep communities that have those choices together. Individuals use their reason to determine the principles, and we want to engage our reason and make sure that we can talk with each other about what principles are important. Together we'll figure out the processes, together we'll figure out the rules, together we'll figure out how goods are distributed, and together we'll determine what counts for being a good person in a particular role. Now, as we said before, we have people who are in all of these lenses. And the gift of ethical agility is that each one of these perspectives makes a difference in how we live together and what's important for our life together. That gets us down to the gifts. As we learn about the different perspectives, we find that listening to each other is hard. Coming up with a solution that embraces and looks at all of these different values is difficult, and so decision-making can be challenging. But the end result, the behaviors that come, the path forward is always better if we listen to each of the lenses and find behaviors and actions that meet the value commitments of those different perspectives. We listen for each other's language and words. Fortunately, the same behaviors can be justified using the different values, and so we find ways of acting and being that will use the values of all the lenses as we find ways to work together. And then we're also sensitive to the fact that different people have ideas about what behaviors count for these values and these virtues that are different than ours, and we begin to accept those and work with them. That then takes us to the path of ethical maturity. Over the course of your lifetime, you get to determine how to live into your best self. And you will find that your behaviors and your beliefs will continually be challenged and tested as you get to a greater understanding of what that means. You will figure out ways to construct your reality in a way that makes some sense. As we determine the meaning of what happens to us, we have different understandings of the world. I was at a Broncos game several weeks ago, and as I was at that game, my best friend who bought the tickets was in our seats together, and she put her water glass into my cup holder. And I got really annoyed with her and was about to let that ruin my experience of the game. And then finally I pulled out my water bottle, and she goes, "Oh, I didn't know you had your own water bottle. I was sharing with you my water because I didn't think you had any." That little tiny incident then shifted my understanding of what was going on and shifted my understanding of the game. And I was able to relax into it and enjoy it in a way that that other little slight would not have allowed me to do. And so as we learn to look at each other with compassion, with kindness, and with our best understanding, we can construct our reality thoughtfully, and then we can become an active participant in creating our world together. Brian Henning talks then about what is required in order to have ethical maturity. He says we have to be willing to change our ideas and our opinions. So often we are afraid that if we change our mind, it will show ethical weakness instead of showing that we are growing and understanding how better to live with each other. The hardest part is to learn to harmonize the tension. When we have differences of ideas and differences of way of being together, how can we stay in that tension until we create a better way to move forward, see a clearer path? And in that process, we have to improvise, use our imagination. Are there different ways of being together? Are there different ways we can put our rules together? Are there different ways that we can distribute resources that will allow a greater number of people to thrive and to grow? What we then need to do is to pay attention. What do we really want? How much do we really need? What is it that we're really trying to accomplish? What do we really believe in this situation? What do we think is the truth? What do we know differently that we can begin to play with? How am I using my power? How am I beginning to understand how to live with others in a way that respects them as well? And am I in fact being a good example? As we ask these questions, we begin to discover our blind spots, places that we were not aware, and we can change our behaviors. We can see the temptations that we face under stress and begin to develop moral courage in the face of those temptations. And hopefully none of us will ever begin to look at our vices and choose deliberately to act unethically. Our values, our identity, our choices all create our ethical self. And so my hope is, as we bring this time together to a close, that each of you will reflect on your ethical perspectives, take a look at the values of those around you, and be willing to develop your own ethical awareness, ethical agility, and commit to a path of ethical maturity over your entire life. Thank you for this time together, and I enjoy learning about yourself and how to effectively be with other people. Thank you.